Okay, now we're recording. Welcome everyone to the Spring Quarterly Planners Forum of the Southwest Washington APA. We've got a great set of speakers here today. We're going to be talking about climate change. And as always, we're going to start with a social justice moment. But before we do, we have a special guest from Commerce here, Catherine McCoy, who is here to make just a couple announcements and introduce herself. Take it away, Catherine.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks very much for our speakers for being here. I, for one, am very excited to hear from the professionals, and each has dedicated themselves to this issue of climate change and the environment. I'm Catherine McCoy. I am a regional planner for Commerce. I'm 2 months in now. I have 13 years of experience in development review at the local level. That includes design review, development standards, shoreline, critical areas, historic preservation, neighborhood planning. I'll be staffing the Southwest Planners Forum for Commerce, and I'll be assisting the jurisdictions of Clark County, Kitsap County, Lewis County, cities in King County. I'll be reviewing amendments, periodic updates, and providing any technical assistance I can. And I am very happy to be here and appreciate everyone else being here too. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine. Appreciate it. Well, we will go ahead and get started here. Our social justice moment, and just as a reminder to everyone, the Southwest Washington APA decided that every time we meet, we were going to devote a few minutes in the beginning to talking about social justice in some form or fashion. So that is going to continue today. I've got 2 very short YouTube videos that we're going to play, less than 5 minutes total. But hopefully it will get our minds in the right place for our topics today. So just a sec here and we will go ahead and take a look at those. And I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty. So what we'll do is I will work on that in the background. In the meantime, we will toss it over to our first speaker, Allison, who's here. She's a senior planner at the Thurston Regional Planning Council with experience in planning related to climate change, which is what we're here to talk about today, land use and growth management. Previously, she worked for Thurston County and holds a master's in environmental studies from the Evergreen State College. So Allison, take it away. I'd love to hear your presentation.
Thanks so much for having me come to talk to your group. I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that's been a collaboration among a number of different cities and Thurston County, and we've been involved with it at TRPC. And I think it's one example of how folks can approach doing climate planning in a way that kind of incorporates some of the differences between different communities and can make it, I think, a little more efficient. So let me just pull these slides up. So just for a bit of background, I work for Thurston Regional Planning Council. Our jurisdiction area is mostly the same as the boundaries of Thurston County, although we do a little bit of support and work for Grays Harbor County, and we've helped with some of our neighbor counties as well. So we are a metropolitan planning organization and a regional transportation planning organization. And our council is made up of 23 different organizations representing different groups within our region. So that is the cities and county and within Thurston County, but also things like school districts, the port, the PUDs, all these different kind of groups that come together and look at a regional level about things that are affecting our community. And we do a lot of work at TRPC around providing data and research to our partners, particularly in areas that cross boundaries. And so transportation is a big one for us, but climate change has been a big one for us as well. It's just something where our economies are really interlinked. And so it's an area where TRPC has kind of stepped in and helped support the work for the region as a whole. And we also frequently operate as a convener for kind of difficult or challenging conversations or things that don't fit neatly with just one part of our community. And that's one reason we got involved with climate change planning in the Thurston region. It goes back quite a while. We did a regional planning process, a pretty big one that wrapped up in 2013 that we called Sustainable Thurston. And that was a big planning process that set a number of goals for regionally how we would like, how folks wanted things to look and feel and grow sustainably, looking out to 2035 at the time. And that it's a ton of data and work went into that, and community engagement informed our countywide planning policies and future comp plan updates. But one of the actions that one of our priority goals in Sustainable Thurston was to move toward a carbon neutral community. And one of the first steps that we identified for that was to do something around climate action planning. So the first step is we got a grant to do a climate adaptation plan through EPA, through the Puget Sound, some of their Puget Sound funding. And it came through Commerce and the Department of Ecology. So thank you, Commerce. This was a watershed-based climate adaptation plan. We wrapped it up in 2018. It had something that we still really use a lot today is the vulnerability assessment that we did as part of it, identifying what the specific risks from climate change would be to the Thurston region. And then in addition to that, we identified a number of different funding, a number of different adaptation actions. And when we wrapped up that process, we really were hearing in the community from folks who said, it's really important that you did this adaptation plan, but we really want to look at the other side of the climate equation and look at climate mitigation. How can we reduce our own contributions to climate change? And so this is mostly what I'm going to talk about in this presentation, although if folks have questions about the adaptation plan, I'm happy to answer them. But for the climate mitigation plan, which was completed in 2020, that ended up being a partnership between 4 of our jurisdictions. So Thurston County, Lacey, Olympia, and Tumwater. And the interesting thing about that is that it was not grant and is not grant funded. It was funded in partnership equally by those 4 jurisdictions who came together and said, we're all interested in having a plan to reduce our emissions and address climate change. It will be more efficient if we work together on it. Instead of each of us doing our own, can we kind of pool our resources and find the funding to make this happen? Because at the time, we didn't have the same kind of federal funding sources that we may have had previously. So it really was a locally driven planning process. The Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan, it includes a bunch of strategies and actions addressing different sectors of our economy and the biggest contributions we have locally around to climate change. And it also includes an implementation strategy that I'll talk about a bit. So the planning process included those jurisdiction partners, so Thurston County, Lacey, Olympia, and Tumwater. We had a steering committee that oversaw that process that included elected officials from each of the jurisdictions. TRPC provided oversight for all of these different pieces. We had a consultant team that we brought on to provide some technical expertise and some support for our outreach work. And we had a community advisory work group made up of folks in the community with different kinds of expertise and perspectives. So there were a lot of moving pieces throughout this process of developing the plan. And we had a lot of public engagement opportunities at various different stages. The first step in our planning effort was to develop shared emission reduction targets. And previous to that, the individual jurisdictions, many of them had done some work around climate change. In Sustainable Thurston, we had set some emissions reduction targets, but they were all different. They were on different timelines with different baselines. And so now we have the same target everyone's pointing toward, and that is to reduce community-wide emissions from the levels we had in 2015 and reduce that 45% by 2030 and 85% by 2050. These targets were adopted back in 2019, and they're a little bit different from the state targets. Sarah might be able to talk a little bit more about those. The state updated their greenhouse gas emission reduction targets in 2020, I believe. And so their numbers are a little bit different, but at the time when we adopted these, this is what everyone agreed on. It was consistent with the information we had at the time. And so this is what we work toward in our plan. A key thing that was a really big part of our discussion is that while we were primarily doing the plan to reduce emissions, hit those targets, it was very important both to our stakeholders and to our jurisdiction partners. They wanted this to be a multi-benefit plan. We wanted to address climate change, but do it in a way that helped us achieve our community goals, including the goals that we had set through that Sustainable Thurston planning process. So we looked at climate actions through the lens of those community goals. What actions and strategies will address climate change, but we want to prioritize the ones that do so in a way that would help create vibrancy in our city centers and along corridors, which is a big strategy that we have, concentrating our urban growth, preserving our sensitive environmental lands and resource lands, maintaining air quality, building our economy. So all of these different goals, we have a goal around food security. And so all of these goals, we thought about these when looking at, for climate actions, what ones will have multiple benefits for our community. So a tool that was really important to our planning process and continues to be is our greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And we had a community group that had been doing greenhouse gas inventories in the past using a standard protocol, and we use that inventory as our information base to understand how are emissions being created in the Thurston region. And our numbers are a little bit different than they are statewide. Every jurisdiction is going to be a little bit different depending on the mix of your activities. But our biggest sectors are from energy use in buildings and from transportation, mostly from passenger vehicles. And so the built environment is our largest source of emissions right now, and that has to do with where we get our power from. And that's a little bit different than what you see statewide or in other communities where transportation is the biggest piece. But those are still our two big ones. And then we have smaller chunks for water and wastewater and agriculture. We did a lot of community engagement. We tried lots of different ways to get people involved. We were planning, some of that got to happen before COVID, some of it happened after COVID. We just tried everything we could to get the word out. It had pretty good broad participation in the planning process. Another tool we had working with our consultants is a carbon wedge analysis. And essentially what it did is through that community planning process, that public input, we gathered a lot of ideas for different actions. We evaluated them according to those goals that we had and kind of came up with a list of here's what we think our priority ones are. And our consultants took those actions and kind of said, well, how do we think, how much are you gonna have to turn those dials in order to reach your targets? So this wedge analysis looks at, here are emissions that have been going up historically. Our targets are we want to reduce them all the way down to an 85% reduction by 2050. And then the wedges that are in here, the different colors, are how different policies and actions that we looked at could reduce our emissions. And there were a couple of big takeaways that we had from looking at that. One is that we looked at the impact of some recently passed state legislation. And this was the year that the Clean Energy Transformation Act passed, or CETA, which puts the state on a pathway for electricity to be 100% renewable from renewable sources. And because our biggest source is our building sector, and that's because of electricity use and natural gas use, that CETA has a huge effect on our ability to meet our targets. So that was eye-opening. These gray chunks are all different state policies that we looked at. So updates to the building code had a big effect for us, those CETA updates, and some state changes around requiring electric vehicles and lower emission vehicles. So we looked at those. There's since been a lot more state legislation that's come out that would definitely change this picture from where it was when we did the analysis. And it's something we may go back and look at again. But it was really helpful to get that picture of how big we needed to rely on the state being successful with this legislation in order to meet our goals. Because these colored wedges really represent our local actions, like what we think we have control over. And it's just a lot less of an impact. Where we think we can have the biggest impact is through some of our transportation and land use planning actions. But there are also a lot of things that we can do in other sectors. And our plan, something that came up working with stakeholders, is folks really wanted to see carbon sequestration be a part of our plan. As I mentioned, we were really interested in multiple goals. We have a lot of planning work going on in the Thurston region around conserving natural resource lands, environmentally sensitive areas, prairie preservation, forest preservation. And there was a lot of interest in thinking about how those ecosystems could also support climate action by being a source for carbon sequestration. And so we have some specific actions and strategies in the plan around increasing the ability of our ecosystems to store carbon in soil and vegetation. And we modeled that out as well. So that's a part of our overall strategy. In total, we kind of rolled everything up into what we call a framework for regional climate action. We are working to support greening our electrical grid, so supporting that state level action and working to increase energy efficiency in our region. And with the expectation that our electrical grid gets greener, we're looking for ways to shift more of our energy sources that are not green onto the electrical grid. So thinking about building electrification, thinking about electric vehicle infrastructure needs, all those things. We have a big focus in our region on kind of under this living lighter plank of supporting our growth management goals by increasing density in our urban neighborhoods, and particularly along our transit corridors, and just building in a way that helps support more people walking and biking and not taking car trips for everything. And that's not possible everywhere in our county. We've got a lot of rural areas as well. But that's definitely been a focus for us. I mentioned the carbon sequestration kind of part of our plan. We're still trying to think about what that means. And we're doing a big part that we recognize the need to build local capacity, to have local leadership around this issue, to build staff capacity, to be thinking about climate change in the way that we do all different types of projects. So that's a general framework that is shared among all of our 4 partner jurisdictions. And as part of that, we have an implementation strategy. We recognize that some of our actions are things that are probably best done at the state level, whether that's changes to the building code or changes to legislation that we might want to see that will enable us to do more locally. Those are things we've kind of identified as being on our legislative agenda. We have some actions where we're continuing to partner as a region, particularly around transportation issues, because those things are just very interconnected. We do that planning at a regional level. We have some actions where the individual jurisdictions, are taking their own path. Lacey or Olympia or Tumwater or Thurston County are each doing a policy, but we share that information among those jurisdictions. And so folks can learn from each other's approaches. And then we have some actions where we need some other entity in the community to take a lead, but the local jurisdictions can support that work. Say our work that our conservation district is doing with local farmers, or work that our wastewater treatment plant is doing to improve their efficiency. So we passed the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan. All the jurisdictions approved it in early 2021. And usually like that's kind of where I end the presentation. We did the plan and the plan is done, great. And then what happens next? In this planning process, something that came up pretty early as we were going through was a desire among parties to say, we don't want to just go through the planning process. We really want to keep working together to get it implemented. There's a lot of communication from the public, from stakeholders in our community who said, we really want to see these things in the plan get done. How are you going to do them? So the jurisdiction said they wanted to continue to work together and created an interlocal agreement to do that. And for the past year, I'd say we've spent a good amount of time thinking about what that means. The transition from a planning process, which you kind of go through these steps to do it, to implementation across all these broad areas, what things you want to handle, how do you want to do things regionally, how do you want to work together, what are your priorities? That has been there's been a lot of discussion and thinking about that for the past year. So it's also been a focus for jurisdictions to think about how to align their budgets and how to align their staffing with the needs identified in the plan, and do the things that they have said that they want to do as part of this plan. But we have got some short-term results to report. Thurston County approved a CPACER financing program, and this is a way of financing different kinds of improvements on commercial property, like could be solar, could be retrofits, could be things for better resilience or different kinds of energy efficiency improvements. But the financing can happen in a way that allows for more flexibility. It's a change that was made at the state level, enabling counties to allow this type of financing. And Thurston County was one of the first counties to approve that program. We have a great partner in our community. We have a group that's doing a lot around community solar and solar group purchasing. And we've also had Puget Sound Energy come in and do a lot of community solar at some initial pilot projects around community solar in our partner communities. And that's been really exciting to see how much interest there is in these programs. At TRPC, we have been working to update the funding criteria for the transportation funding we get federally, and we work to distribute to our community. And it's now that funding criteria is being updated to better align with the climate mitigation plan and our other community goals. And our individual jurisdictions have been working on a whole bunch of different stuff. Just two examples is Lacey recently updated their electric vehicle parking standards to be in line with the climate mitigation plan. And Olympia has a lot of stuff going on, but is one of the exciting things is they got some funding to do a group purchasing program that will help install more electric heat pumps in buildings. So like I mentioned, our partners have said they do want to continue to work regionally to implement the climate mitigation plan, and they've passed a long-term agreement to continue that partnership. And again, it's Thurston County, Lacey, Olympia, and Tumwater. TRPC continues to be the program coordinator for that. And what they've said they want to do is to continue to have a group that helps maintain momentum on climate action, that helps find these efficient regional solutions and be able to learn from each other and provide accountability back out to the public about the progress that we're making, as well as building public awareness and engagement around the work we're doing for climate change. So some of the things that we're working on in this next year is around those different areas. We might continue to have that steering committee that meets and talks about what their priorities are. They developed a set of legislative priorities for this year, for example, that we brought to our legislative representatives during this session. And we're working on some different regional solutions. This year, our focus is on kind of unpacking what we want to do regionally around energy efficiency, digging into some questions around carbon sequestration. We're getting some information about potential costs of looking at more building electrification, and really looking into what are other financing options we have for some of the different actions we want to take on. At TRPC, we're also going to be taking on more. One thing we're doing regionally for all the jurisdictions is having a centralized place where we're tracking progress, and that means tracking both our greenhouse gas emissions and also how we're doing on implementing actions in the plan. So things that I think made the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan successful: we had a lot of public interest. We had some really strong voices in the community going to the jurisdictions and saying, we really want you to do this. This is a priority for us. It's important. That's not always present in every community. They showed up all over the place at every public meeting and made it clear that it was a priority. And that really, our elected officials heard that loud and clear. And another important thing is that we had and continue to have elected officials at all our jurisdictions who think that working on climate change and working regionally on climate solutions is important and a priority. We had something, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but with having staff at each of the jurisdictions was really key to the success. I think it's been a challenge at the staff level to find capacity to work on climate issues because it's so broad. There's so many different things that are a part of it, and many of the staff are doing it in addition to kind of dealing with housing and GMA updates and all these other things that are on their plates. And so it's been nice to be able to share that load a little bit across our 4 jurisdictions because everyone has a slightly different specialty. And then I can't emphasize enough how important the changes at the state level that have been happening and are continuing to happen are to setting us up locally to be successful in our targets. There's so much that's going on. There's so many different programs that are out there, and it's pretty exciting to see Washington State really be a leader on this issue. So just kind of in summary, some lessons that we've learned along the way. I think all our partners would say that they appreciate the regional collaboration. It does make things more efficient. You don't have to go and reinvent the wheel 4 times over. There's a lot of things that we have in common. And so we have just, one plan and everyone can focus on their own implementation. That said, when you've got 4 partners with different elected bodies and different publics and different priorities, the more of those partners you add, the more complex that decision-making gets. So it can take longer. And the expectations in those different communities can be a little bit different. And so you have some jurisdictions or some stakeholders who want to move really fast in a certain area. And we have to, go through the process of bringing everyone along together at a regional level. And that's something we're still working through and understanding as we move into implementation. How much do we want to move together on things regionally? And how much for some jurisdictions that have the capacity or have the interest, if they want to move ahead in certain areas and other of our partners aren't quite ready, like how do we navigate all of that and still be part of this regional agreement? Something I really want to emphasize is that if your jurisdiction is looking to do a climate plan of any kind, I think that it is important in developing the plan to be thinking about how you're going to implement it. I know that's basic planning 101. You got to do that anyway, but I feel like it's been especially true for the climate mitigation plan. There's been a lot of pressure in the community to see results, to see the actions implemented. And it takes time to reorient work programs, to build staff capacity, to build expertise internally, and to kind of turn those kind of big programmatic ships and get them aligned. And don't underestimate the time it takes to kind of reorient and to be able to focus on some of the things, because none of the other work is going away, right? Tied to that, I think it's really important to build internal capacity across different departments and programs. Often, and this is the same in our process, you maybe have one planner who's kind of designated as you're working on the climate plan. But climate mitigation and adaptation actions, they affect all levels of projects and programs. And there are so many different components to it. And you're going to need your public works folks, you're going to need your public health folks, you're going to need all of these different departments thinking with a climate focus in order to get this work done. And it really is beneficial to take the time to build relationships across those different jurisdictions to make sure that that work is filtering down to that level. And another thing, I don't think we've got the solution to this, but in our planning process, we did that wedge analysis, and we had all our actions, and it basically said, you've got to do all these things. We have a long list of actions, and the challenge is like how, we've got limited time, there's limited bandwidth for our elected officials and certainly for staff, understanding how to prioritize things, and where you can partner and hand things off, how to kind of distribute that work and how to be effective in bringing things forward, I think can be a challenge because climate change it's frightening. We're feeling the effects in our community. It feels like an emergency, but it's a very slow emergency. And it's how to take these kind of big policy steps that take time to develop, when sometimes it feels, and you may hear from the public, that they want to see this action happening faster. That can be pretty overwhelming. And I think just something to think about is how are you going to prioritize, and how are you going to dedicate resources, and what things do you want to get done first to show some traction. So I'll end it there. Happy to take questions if we have any, or if we have time. Check with Nick.
Thank you so much, Allison. I think we do have time for questions. And I've got a handful of questions of my own, but I thought that presentation was most excellent. I want to compliment you. The plan is very cool, and also the graphics were pretty slick. So I enjoyed that. Are there any questions for Allison? I know I have a couple, but I'd love to hear from others. And we can do this really informally. You can just unmute yourself if you'd like. Okay, that's okay. I've got plenty. So Allison, there's a few things that stood out to me. And one of the first things that I want to ask you is, I know that other jurisdictions in Southwest Washington have had the challenge of determining, what benchmarks or what goals are we trying to meet in terms of greenhouse gas reduction and things like that. So when you were showing your carbon wedge, I noticed that federal goals weren't necessarily specifically called out on that carbon wedge. And so I'm wondering, because there are other jurisdictions in Southwest Washington that have tied their greenhouse gas emission targets to federal reduction goals, Why not in Thurston County?
When we were setting our emission targets, we kind of aligned them with what was the best available science at the time. And it was also kind of tied to, as I mentioned, we had set some targets a while back through Sustainable Thurston for what we wanted to accomplish. And so we just updated those, and that's what we tied it to. So we were looking at the IPCC recommendations, which at the time, that's kind of how it laid out. Since then, there's been some stronger, Washington State has come out with different standards. There's more of a consensus around shooting to limiting global climate change to 1.5 degrees of warming, which is an even faster threshold. So that we do have, even though those are our regional goals, we do have some sub goals within that for some of our communities are trying to see, can we get there? Can we get farther faster? So we didn't look, I think when we were looking at the targets, we looked at some of the federal goals, but at the time we weren't seeing like there might be a lot that we could tie to at the federal level, if that makes sense. And so we were really looking at, well, what are our goals? What do we want to achieve as a community? It's something that we may revisit in the future. I think particularly for better alignment with the state goals. But I'm always like when people are like, well, why aren't you going net zero or this or that? I'm like, we want to get to all the goals, but these are the goals we have. We can track against this, and if we do better, that's great. We can come back and do these. So I think just having the same targets was our big achievement.
Yeah, I think your point highlights that the inherent lesson that yes, climate action is something that is driven by science, hopefully, but it's also like a political decision a lot of the time, or at least in practice. So I thought that was a good example of that. So you mentioned briefly sort of some partners want to get farther faster. And I thought your last point, your lesson learned about prioritizing and partnering was one that was really well taken. And so I guess my question is, how did you, it's pretty incredible regional planning like this can, occur successfully, in my opinion. How did you structure it so that the communities and the partners that you worked with kind of knew who was on first, right? Like who is going to take lead roles, who's going to take supporting roles? I can see that as sort of a gap that maybe other regions would struggle with.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say like, well, one, we've got a really strong track record of working together regionally, and that has served us well. So not everyone has that. I always, we're very fortunate to have the kind of relationships that we have in the Thurston region among our jurisdictions. That said, it's still something I feel we're going to continue to have to work through that. Mainly what we do is so as part of our ongoing work, we have a staff team of staff from each of the jurisdictions who meet periodically, and even between them can share information so people know what are you planning to work on. In many cases, it might be, so we have, one of our jurisdictions was able to dedicate I'd say more funding and has dedicated staff since the adoption of the plan. And other ones are doing that, but it hasn't happened as quickly. And so where we've got capacity at one jurisdiction, I think there's been a willingness to say, we'll at least here, we're planning to work on this. Is this of interest to folks? Do you have any concerns about it? And where there are opportunities to do things like, we've got this cost assessment this year around building electrification. And that was something that started with one jurisdiction wanted some answers to what those costs might be and brought it to the group. And the other jurisdiction said, yeah, we want that too. Let's do one for the whole region. And so we were able to partner on that. So I really feel like it comes down to, there's people ask me all the time, like kind of who's running the show. And I'm like, well, it really depends on the action. Like you kind of talk about it and say, well, who's kind of logically ready to move forward on this? Who has the expertise? Who has the bandwidth? And is there, being aware of where there might be sensitivities in the other jurisdictions about how you proceed. So far, I think we're doing really well of just like keeping those lines of communication open.
That's impressive work effort. Yeah, I appreciate that. And again, sort of the lesson there being strategize, understand what work all the various jurisdictions are doing on their own, and really capitalize on those opportunities is what I'm hearing.
I think it's also important, we've been clear about this, that we have that framework and we share the same framework, but the implementation is being done by the individual jurisdictions. There are things that they may decide to partner on regionally, but like implementation is at the discretion of each jurisdiction and their priorities, and their legislative bodies, their city councils and their county commissions decide how they want to move forward on specific things. That's not decided at a regional level. We're not dictating down and saying you have to do this on this timeline. We're saying these are the things that need to get done to meet your goal. And different jurisdictions have the option they can take different pathways there, and they are. And that's fine. That's just under the umbrella.
So you mentioned the framework, and I have sort of my last question will be about that. But before we move on to the last question about framework, does anybody have anything that they would like to add or ask of Allison before we move on to our next speaker? Okay, well, I'm glad that you brought up the climate mitigation framework. I've used frameworks for a variety of other sort of large regional type projects. And I noticed on the left side of the framework there, you had a bar that kind of went across all of the various panels that said equitable distribution of cost and benefits. And so I guess my question is, was there planning that happened before you got to the climate mitigation framework to really understand what you guys meant by equitable distribution? Like how much framework building around equity went into the climate mitigation framework?
It's a good question. I feel like it became a bigger question as we went through the process. I don't think it was set up there really from the start, but as we do have a goal in Sustainable Thurston around ensuring everyone in our community has what they need to meet their needs, and that they have access to those things. So we did think about equity in that way when we were evaluating. We thought about, so something we struggled with in the plan with equity is that there are different ways to define it. I don't think in our region we had discussed it in detail and really thought about it. We've done a lot of work since then. We have more data that we've put together, kind of understanding better the inequities in the Thurston region. And so something we've talked about is that, so we talk in the plan, we have a section where we talk about, here are kind of the different ways that that climate mitigation activities can perpetuate inequities, or they can help to address them. But I think it was difficult when we were evaluating actions to say, we were looking for what would have the broadest effect on our community goals. And then we also wanted to say, well, there's probably some ways we could target these a little bit more to address inequities. And those things could be, trade-offs. But we said that's something we should probably deal with in implementation. How we implement these actions need to be equitable. So that was the guiding principle we had in the plan, is that the way that we do this work, we need to be thinking to make sure that if we have some kind of program, that it is being developed in a way that people will have access to it, that it's being distributed to across our community to folks who may not traditionally have access to these things, and to think about some of that data. So we have a couple of specific actions in the plan where we said here are some areas we need to understand more about, and we have kind of a process of ways, and when we get to specific areas, of thinking about some of those questions around equity. But I'd say it's, I'm sure everyone's been working on these issues. They're challenging, they're really, really difficult. I don't think that we have solved it or have a perfect process. It's something we're just going to continue to need to think through as we go forward.
Yeah, a work in progress, and it continues. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm going to give you some virtual applause here. It'd be so nice once we get all back in a room together face to face, and maybe you could get some like real applause, but we'll have to satisfy with the virtual applause for now. Thank you so much, Allison. Really appreciate it. I thought that was a great presentation, and yeah, very helpful for us.
If anyone has follow-up or questions, don't hesitate to reach out if you have a question about some specific thing or how we did something. Feel free to reach out. We're happy to share that information.
I love that. Yeah, we can make sure that your contact information is available. Well, great. Well, now we'll keep us on task, and we will go to our next speaker, Sarah Fox, who joined Growth Management Services as the lead of a multi-year project to develop guidance for counties and cities to address climate change. She's got over 18 years of expertise in local government policy development, current development review, long-range planning, and environmental planning. She has also managed several high-profile, sensitive, and controversial projects, and she's got the scars to prove it. And she's also a U.S. Army veteran and serves as a council member for the city of Vancouver. So without further ado, Sarah, take it away, please. And we're not hearing you, Sarah.
No, there's a button that tends to get pushed sometimes. It's a little weird. Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Oh, great. Okay. And can you see the presentation side and not the notes side?
Looks great.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. Sarah Fox, and I did start working for Commerce just about 7 months ago. And I will tell you why I was hired to work for them, but primarily to run the climate program. And before I get there, let me also introduce the whole Department of Commerce to everyone, because the mission of Commerce is really to strengthen communities through every aspect of community development by providing financial aid and technical assistance to many parts of our communities. So the climate program was basically came to us through a few ways. First, there was a legislation that was proposed called House Bill 1099 in two sessions ago. And it was all about creating a new climate change goal to the Growth Management Act, creating a climate change and resiliency element that would be added to comprehensive plans. And it would have required greenhouse gas and VMTs, vehicle miles traveled, reduction plans to be added to your transportation and land use plans. All of that was in order to also be consistent with the state's greenhouse gas emission targets that are found in RTW 70A 45020. So what they did is it didn't pass in 2021, and the legislature instead decided to put a down payment on the work, and they created a budget section, also called a proviso, that carved out $3 million to get a head start on this work. They were very optimistic that House Bill 1099 was going to pass this session in 2022. It didn't. However, the proviso is in effect until 2023. So that means that the legislature still has time to come back next session and get the work done, hopefully. But in the meantime, we're going to continue to do this work in advance of these requirements being put in place. And so what we're working on is creating a model element, and they've actually described it as two sub-elements, a mitigation sub-element and a resiliency sub-element. And the mitigation sub-element is will create policies that reduce the transportation and land use greenhouse gas emissions. And it also includes targets for reducing the per capita vehicle miles traveled. The resiliency sub-element will be an element that includes all the policy and planning guidance that will address those natural hazards that are worsened by climate change and will enhance the resilience within communities. And all of these sub-elements will also have ways to maximize co-benefits and prioritize what they call in the proviso the overburdened communities that are most impacted by climate change now and in the future. And we've set up the project to get to the end of the biennial budget, which is June 2023, by kind of working through different phases of the project. And so we've set up kind of this in phases by, as you can see on this chart, but we have the initialization phase, which was really just getting our staff on board and figuring out how we were going to work with different state agencies, which I'll get to next. But we have within the proviso other state agencies that are part of the project team. And so we had to really figure out how we were all going to work together and move through this process. And also all of those agencies had to bring staff into the project. And then the phase that we're in now, we're calling the definition phase. And it really is all about taking a look at what all these things mean. What does mitigation and resilience mean? Let's take a look at all of the really good examples out there, like what our Thurston Regional Council's doing and others are doing out there. And we are compiling a list of measures, actions and policies from all of these plans and from our agencies, maybe the measures that they have identified in their work, being subject matter experts, might not be in a plan, but would be what they would suggest to address that particular aspect of climate change mitigation or resilience. And we're collecting all of those and really taking a look at how we can put together, kind of put them into the two baskets of these sub-elements. And then moving from that stage, we'll be taking a look at how to, what we're calling the design and development phase, but we'll be looking at different ways to prioritize those measures. And that's where all those other pieces come in with co-benefits and ensuring that we are prioritizing those actions that will not further burden the communities that are already burdened by climate change, and really taking a look at how best to create that prioritization method. And we'll also be, of course, adding in measures as we find gaps, in this process of this iterative process of review and moving forward and designing this these model elements. And then the final phase, we're calling the momentum phase, is really all about testing and taking our drafts forward to different communities and really showing our work, getting feedback, going back to all of our collaborative teams that we've created in this process and asking them if we heard them and what didn't we get right, and fixing that. We will be launching a pilot program in the fall that will be working directly with several different cities around the state to see about how to implement, how to add the climate change elements into their comprehensive plans and really troubleshooting our guidance as well. And then the final draft phase is exactly that. At this point, it'll be next spring. We'll be getting to the end of the project, and we will really be at that point getting the final analysis, final documentation from all of our partner agencies to really show our work, show that we have been listening, that we've been working with all of these various groups and presenting our work to the legislature. So to get there, as I was mentioning, we are working currently with state agencies. We're working with Ecology, WSDOT, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Military Department, Department of Health. We are also launching a meeting next week with, I think we've invited about 150 tribal representatives to a briefing. We have begun a process of working with we're finalizing a contract with a nonprofit that will put together, I think it will be 7 different groups around the state that represent those frontline communities that I was speaking about, also to contribute to this effort. And who am I missing? And then we've also created what we call these chapter review groups. And I know I recognize a few folks in our meeting today that have joined those chapter review groups. And they are from both from our cities, counties, and regional governments. So we've put together quite a few groups to really help us. And what we're doing with each of these groups is focusing right now, as I was mentioning, on that menu of policies, those measures, actions, the good examples out there, putting that together right now. And then we'll be shifting to designing a prioritization method that really adds to the value of how to select which policy is best for your community, which measure or policy can address climate change issues, but also, uplift those communities that have been overburdened, that might also address some aspect of perhaps sea level rise, or improve a wetland, or it has what other co-benefits may it offer to the community. And then along with all of this, we'll be putting together that planning guidance and really ensuring that it's useful to our cities and our counties out there. And then we'll talk a little bit more about each of the elements, just to deep dive now that I've given a bit of an overview. So the mitigation sub-element. So for those that may not know, the word mitigation is used in a lot of different planning efforts, but in this context, we're speaking primarily about the efforts that reduce or prevent emissions of greenhouse gas. And it will include, it will identify the actions that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and achieve those statewide goals that I mentioned at the beginning. We'll also be looking at the measures that the city has control over that can reduce the VMT, no matter what the size of your city is, or if you're more rural or more urban. So we'll be looking at those measures that you have control over as a city or a county. And then some of the sources of greenhouse gas emissions that you'd be looking at to reduce. So we're looking at the infrastructure, the energy systems, economic systems. Where is industry? What kind of industry do you have? What kind of control do you have over those particular economic drivers in your community and how they utilize the land? We're looking at land use, zoning, housing emissions, obviously transportation. We're just kind of focusing on that one earlier, rural emissions, and then also, any of these goals and policies that we do recommend be added to your comprehensive plans. We're really also focusing on whether or not they actually, we use the word demonstrated ability. So we're looking at that demonstrated ability to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's a lot of work that we're, I guess, in our conversations right now with our agency partners, like the Department of Ecology and DNR and Department of Transportation, is really finding out if there's a way that we can really show that this particular measure works better than another, and how well does it work. And if we can get that information in the hands of our cities and counties, again, so that you can make the best decisions for your community. The resilience sub-element, this element is, we have a quote here from FEMA's National Mitigation Framework, but it really sums it all up. But resilience is an outcome, the state of being able to adapt to changing conditions, and then withstand and rebound from the impacts of disasters and incidents. So the sub-element will help identify and protect and enhance the natural areas and habitat in your communities. It will address natural hazards that are exacerbated by climate change. The element will support adaptation to climate impacts, and it'll include measures that really speak to environmental justice, which is a whole nother subtopic that I won't get into today. And then also kind of going back to earlier, the demonstrated kind of that demonstrated effectiveness piece of our project, but the sub-elements measures need to be scientifically credible as well, based on the climate projections and impact scenarios. The guidance that we are developing for the resilience sub-element it will show jurisdictions how to conduct a risk assessment. We've been looking at a lot of best practices that are out there by FEMA, NOAA, AWC. We've been given a list of other really great resources that we're going through right now. And when we do put together or publish our guidance, we're hoping to just make that a very small but powerful list of guidance so that you're not handed 100 resources and have to kind of weed through that yourselves. So at the end of the day, hopefully there'll be just a small list of resources that are really going to help you conduct that risk assessment. And then we also have in our current proviso, it has a section about talking about those communities that already have hazard mitigation plans. And we are working really closely right now with FEMA and our military department to take a look at what's currently required in a hazard mitigation plan that they approve. And then they're going to have some changes coming down the way in a couple of years that will shift a little bit more to guidance about climate change. I don't think at this point that their plans are going to require that communities include, planning for the hazards that are exacerbated by climate change. I can't speak to that exactly yet, but our guidance will include kind of that crosswalk between the two, and what's different about what we're requiring in a climate-focused resilience plan versus what could be in your hazard mitigation plan. So perhaps we can nudge communities to go a little bit further in their plans, and then they could adopt that hazard mitigation plan in lieu of perhaps putting together a resilience plan for their communities. And then, as I was mentioning kind of earlier, there will be a few things that both sub-elements need to include. So both sub-elements need to maximize those co-benefits. So identifying, what social, economic, and environmental co-benefits that measure could have. Does it increase housing affordability? Does it improve, wetland habitat, salmon recovery? What other ecosystem services might that measure do for your community? Tribal treaty rights. A lot of communities have aspects of tribal treaty rights that they need to be including in their plans. And then finally, how do we prioritize these measures? How do we uplift those communities that have been most impacted by climate change? We have actually a map that's available. I have a link here, and I'll make these slides available to everyone at the end of this presentation as well. But it links to the Department of Health's Environmental Health Disparities Map. And this map really includes several factors that really lead to a very clear identification of those communities that have already been impacted by climate change. And it also shows how, actually, I'm not sure, I might be getting the two maps mixed up, but you know how it is, you look at about 1 million different things in a week, but I think there's a different map out there anyways that'll show you what effects climate change has over time. And I don't think this is the map, but this map does clearly show you, those areas that are most impacted by their location in our state for the different effects of heat and the choices along our economic development realms of the impacts from, I think this little impact right now is showing hazardous waste, it says proximity to other things like lead risk and whatnot, and wastewater discharge and all of those things in this particular snapshot. And that's the end of my presentation.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I'm glad that you sort of left off with some of those resources. I was just saying that I've used the environmental health disparities map before. It's a really good resource, and it's instructive for a variety of sort of planning efforts. I've used it in the development of health impact assessments, but it's a good resource that everybody should become familiar with if they're not. But fascinating to see what's happening from a legislative perspective and on the state level. Are there any questions for Sarah about anything that she went over?
Hi, this is Esther Larson. Are you able to hear me?
Hi,
Yes.
Esther, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I've been on the legislative committee of the Washington chapter of APA for, about 20 years. And one of the big issues that we had for our priorities for the chapter this year was climate change. And unfortunately, due to some what was described as timing issues and political items at the very end of the session last Thursday evening, 1099 didn't get another vote that was needed from the House to be able to have that bill pass as the recommended conference committee version, which did pass the Senate. But at any rate, one of the things that I'm interested in is how, in regard to what you're doing right now at Commerce, are you going to be involved at all in the Roadmap 3 project to try to work with any of the issues that you described for resiliency, and perhaps having some of those issues be addressed by that particular group?
That's a really good question. I'm not working with the roadmap directly. My supervisor, Dave Anderson, is. However, just yesterday, so it's all very fresh at the end of the session of how
Yes.
to the scars haven't healed yet, but we were just talking yesterday, actually, the legislative team that was leading on the House Bill 1099 work, and kind of what to do, how to move forward from here. And part of the discussion was just really focusing on our major cities and counties, which, Thurston County, Thurston Regional Planning Commission, and some of those other, very large population areas of our state are already working on, climate action work, climate planning. And so in that way, we were trying to, I guess, stay upbeat on the fact that there is work that's already moving forward without being, regulated at this point. I do know that they are, thinking about some of those other ideas about what they can do, perhaps through, some of these other projects moving forward that, again, may not end up being the route of 1099, which was to actually include it as a goal in the Growth Management Act. So it's all on the table, I guess is what I'm saying. We'll see, and maybe I'll have more information, particularly probably near the end of the summer or next fall, when we're really deciding what the plan of action will be for next session.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. The other thing, do you ever have any specific meetings with the Washington chapter of APA on this particular thing, or is that just something Dave Anderson, who does come to some of the Friday Zoom meetings, just is the representative on working with the chapter?
I haven't, my program hasn't been to the,
Mhm.
we tend to do these workshops that we meet with the different
Oh.
sections, and
Okay.
also with the planning directors
Mhm.
meetings. And also we've been out in front of the AWC at the December meeting that AWC had. So I've
Mhm.
presented to them. I know that will be, I think I'm going to be facilitating a climate session during the AWC conference coming up here in a couple months in Vancouver. So really just, and I'm making our way around with the different groups that are already
Mhm.
meeting.
Well, that's great. I'd also ask you if you're interested, please do a presentation at the chapter conference, which is going to be a live conference this year down in I think it's in
I think it's in
Vancouver.
Vancouver.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I'm in
Yeah, it's in
Vancouver.
Vancouver in October. I
Yeah,
was
because
actually planning to put
okay,
together a
that'd be
session.
great because
Yeah.
I think what you presented was very timely, and thank you for all your work.
And also just to save I might have spent too much time on the timeline, but maybe the point to mention is that next fall is really when we're hoping to have a really good draft of the guidance and these model elements that we would be wanting to showcase a bit and get feedback from everyone at that conference. That's kind of what we're leading to, is to be able to show more of what we're working on to a broader audience at that time.
That'd be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other questions for Sarah? Sarah, I was really happy to see that addressing rural emissions is sort of like in the scope. I think that's a really important part, both to address emissions, but also making sure that our rural communities are involved in these sort of larger statewide planning efforts and aren't being left out. So I appreciate that. Other questions before we move on to our last speaker? Okay.
I have a question to pose, and I don't think there's any easy answer to this, Sarah, but this has been on my mind recently about some of the state goals that come down, and at the city level, sometimes they feel like they might conflict a little bit. And one that's been troubling me recently is our housing goals and our climate goals. And what I'm kind of worried about is there's very worthy goals to increase density and to build on narrow lots and to provide more housing, more affordable housing. But sometimes that feels like it might conflict with our climate goals. There's not as much room to retain trees. There's not as much room to plant trees when we start building more dense. And I don't know, I guess I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on maybe like syncing up these goals, or maybe like advice from the state coming down to kind of implement these growth management goals in concert with each other. If you just have any thoughts on how these sometimes seem like they might be in conflict with each other, but don't have to be.
No, that's perfect. That is actually one of the biggest questions I've been running around in my head and with my team. Might have skipped this part, but Commerce actually created 2 policy teams, or a local government division created 2 policy teams this year, which they've never had before. This particular group has always had the regional planners, like Catherine, that have just worked at a regional level on comp plans and whatnot. And so the policy teams that they created was the climate team and this housing team. And the 2 policy teams have really been wondering that same question, how do you accomplish both parts? And we don't have an answer. It is definitely something we've identified as can be in conflict. In fact, the last version of House Bill 1099, before it died, they had tried to put a bunch of, they put a bunch of the middle housing policies into the House Bill 1099, and they just kind of shoved it in there. Didn't seem to have, again, that much of a flow and a connection to the rest of the climate goals and House Bill 1099. And it was kind of hard to say, well, how exactly are you going to meet the climate goals that you're talking about earlier when you're talking about, like you said, putting in as much housing as you can into a particular area without any, perhaps, let's use the other form of mitigation, right? The other mitigation for the effects of the loss of the canopy cover and whatnot. So definitely is on our mind as to how to marry those two together. So I appreciate the question, but I don't have an answer.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Appreciate it. Good question, Melissa. Okay, well, with that, if we don't have any other questions for Sarah, we will turn it over to our next speaker, Rebecca, City of Vancouver, I believe. I will ask you to introduce yourself, but please go ahead and take it away.
All right. Is my audio all right? Are we hearing okay?
You sound great.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be here with you and an honor to follow one of my city councilwomen in presenting to you all. I am a senior policy analyst at the City of Vancouver in the city manager's office, and I have the honor of working on the city's first climate action plan. So I'll be working on the development over the next couple of months, and then we move full force into implementation. So with that, I will pull up a brief slideshow, and I hope that I can leave plenty of time for questions if we have any at the end. Sorry, I have used Zoom before. Just a moment. Okay, I think we've got this. All right. So the City of Vancouver has been working on its climate action plan since early 2021. The initial effort from the city was just to develop a roadmap towards putting together a general suite of strategies that would help us lower our greenhouse gas emissions. However, as we moved through the process, we had the benefit of a very knowledgeable and motivated council that had a really strong desire to make significant progress on addressing climate change for our community. I think a few things kind of came together, kind of the opportune time to put that wind beneath our wings. I believe we were delivering our presentation of findings right after the heat dome in June. So I think that really it really put our climate future front and foremost in people's minds. And so at that time, council gave us direction to move forward with a full climate action plan.
And Rebecca, I'm gonna let you know we're not seeing anything. It's just a sort of black blank screen.
Oh no. All right. How are we doing now?
There you go. I see the title slide. Yep.
All right. Okay. All right. So I'll just start out with kind of our baseline conditions. In 2019, we did an updated greenhouse gas inventory for the city. It was the first one that we had done in 12 years. And we found a few things. One, that is too long of a time to go in between looking at our greenhouse gas footprint. And the second was that we had a lot of opportunities as a city to make significant cuts to our contributions to climate change. We found that, as with most cities, our biggest contributors were transportation and building energy, the energy that we use to heat and cool and cook in our residential, commercial, and industrial buildings, with smaller contributions from waste streams and industrial processes, rogue emissions, and a large share of our emissions come from air travel and aviation. We are very close to the Portland International Airport, and we also have a small airfields within the city as well. Aviation emissions are generally considered Scope 3 emissions. So what that means for us as a city is that these are not necessarily sources that we have direct control over. So functionally for us as a city, we want to focus on the areas where we know that we can have a direct and meaningful impact on making reductions. Oh. So at the outset, we got very aggressive targets from our council, which is very exciting for us as staff, also a little terrifying, but in a good way. It's a bigger challenge than I think we were expecting, and it's really motivated us to pursue some courses of actions that I don't know if we would have felt we had the support to pursue. But council was very clear that they wanted us to pursue a pathway that would get us to an interim target of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for just municipal operations by 2025, an 80% reduction for the city as a whole by 2030. And then by 2040, we're seeking to reach carbon neutrality. So for most jurisdictions, I think the recommendation from the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, where most of those jurisdictions are pursuing carbon neutrality by 2050. So we're really trying to get a move on. We were also directed to not wait until we got a fully established, fleshed out, adopted plan to get moving on trying to make some emissions right away. We were given a set of 13 actions proposed by our community roundtable sessions and survey responses, and which was supported by our city council. So it was a package of actions that we knew that as a city, we had strong support for these actions, and they were mostly pertaining to municipal actions, things that we as a city could go forward kind of under our own direction, things that were in our authority to get moving on right away. All right, so we've been working with a consultant to help us with modeling our existing emissions and to kind of help us put a framework around what kind of reductions could we see from different actions. So for every action that we could reasonably model, they've helped us put a kind of a carbon price tag on those. And if you can, just a quick explanation of this graph here. The black line is what we would see if no action was taken on climate change whatsoever. You see there's a general downward trend up until about 2019. If we didn't do anything to change our trajectory, then population increase and development and growth would take us in the opposite direction. The blue line shows us the reductions that we can hopefully achieve with federal and state regulations. So that's a mix of federal fuel standards, our state building code, CETA, Clean Fuel Standard, and Clean Buildings Performance Standard. So kind of a collection of those actions and the Washington Climate Commitment Act, collection of those actions, actually, they make significant advances towards reducing statewide carbon emissions and therefore City of Vancouver's as well. That does still leave us with a pretty sizable gap to fill with local actions. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about the early action package because that was, I think that was something unique that we were directed to do, and it's really had some exciting results for us. And I would really recommend any jurisdiction that's still working on a climate action plan or kind of thinking of going down a similar path to consider putting together a little subset of kind of like early actions to start getting people to think about the work that you're doing, to start engaging people throughout your city departments or throughout your jurisdiction's departments, to start getting everyone thinking about the action that you're trying to take, the direction that you're going, and understanding that, you know, making progress on these goals isn't the work of one department. Every different department, every agency has their own responsibility towards meeting these targets. All right, so in October of 2021, we had some of our departments were already working on some of the actions that were proposed. So we had a little bit of early movement on some of the ideas, but we didn't have any dedicated staff capacity to, you know, kind of help, help move that work forward and, you know, kind of be an overarching project manager and just kind of make sure that everybody knew what they were responsible for and, you know, kind of keep those meetings on people's calendars, keep, you know, set up checkpoints and goals for making progress on those. So a couple of months later, just having a little bit of dedicated staff capacity towards advancing those, we're able to get a move on every action except for one, and make some significant progress on a couple of them, which is really exciting. And I would just add, one thing that I was surprised by was how motivated people throughout our city, our, you know, kind of like our city staff were to start working on these issues. In some cases, again, they had already been working on these efforts independently of their own accord for years. But I was somewhat expecting a little bit of resistance. Change is always hard. It's anytime you're asking somebody to add more to their workload, you know, I don't really expect an open arm welcome from that. But we've really encountered, you know, nothing but enthusiasm, which is a very pleasant surprise for me. So I'll just go through quickly just so you can kind of see a few examples of the kinds of actions that we're putting into our final cap and these early actions that we are talking about. Again, transportation and buildings and energy is our biggest opportunity for making reductions. So we're working on developing a green building policy for city-owned buildings, and then any construction that we are sponsoring or supporting as a city. We're going to go through all of our own buildings, all of the buildings that are in our city's portfolio, and make sure that we are in line for early compliance with the clean building standards, that we are taking advantage of Clark PUD, our electrical utility, that we're taking full advantage of the opportunities that they offer to purchase renewable electricity, and that we're working with our partners in Clark County to kind of work with the programs that they already have for helping to weatherize and improve building heating and cooling efficiency for low income and affordable housing residents. This is already something that the county addresses with federal funding, but if we can partner with the city, there's a possibility that we can expand the eligible range of residents who can access those services. Right now, of course, those services are kind of income limited to the lowest, the lowest income group, 0 to 30% of area median income. But there are a lot of folks who need help keeping their home warm, that are paying too much for electricity because they have very little insulation in their house, or they have old windows, or, you know, kind of any list of things. So what can we do to expand those services, working with our housing department and with our partners at the county? For transportation, of course, there's an effort to move our personal fleets to electric. One thing that our fleet was very clear on was that only electric was it's not a one size fits all. We need to look at a range of strategies to reduce our carbon footprint in transportation, because there's not an electric replacement for every kind of vehicle or piece of equipment that the city owns and operates. Think like a sewer back truck, or a boom lift for our forestry folks to go take care of problematic tree limbs. These just don't, the market has not yet provided an electric replacement. So we also want to be exploring, for where we don't have an electric option, we want to look at every possible way that we can just step down the carbon intensity of the fuels that we use. So we're putting together a plan to replace our diesel with renewable diesel. Where can we work with some of our city partners to look at using compressed natural gas or hydrogen fuel cells? Where can we substitute hybrids where we don't have a full electric replacement? So we're really trying to put together a kind of a diverse portfolio of options that that we can look at to just kind of keep that steady downward trajectory in our carbon emissions. Our wastewater and solid waste, we've got a lot of opportunities just to kind of do better in our own buildings with our own staff. One of our first steps that I mentioned is we're putting together, now that people are coming back to buildings again, and we've got folks working in office in person, this is a great time for us to step up our efforts to make sure that every building that has regular occupancy has the option for food composting and kind of more advanced recycling opportunities. So we're working with our cleaning staff and our solid waste folks to put a program into place and get that up and running. And then finally, governance, which is, I work in the city manager's office, so this kind of suite is very particular to my work. Making sure that we have enough staff is so critical for any city that is trying to make progress on climate actions. There's everyone who works for you has a million things on their plate, and it is so helpful to just be able to have, one person whose job it is to keep reminding people, keep setting up those meetings, and just kind of keep the balls rolling forward to make progress on that. We currently have half an FTE dedicated to that work. I truly hope that we can bring some more. I think that would be really helpful as when we move into our full, the full implementation of the entire CAP. That's going to be, it's going to be really important to have enough hours in a week to, kind of work, get moving on the many, many, many actions that are going to be in that final plan. All right, so I'm going to step kind of go a little bigger picture now and look at the overall climate action plan that we have been working on. We've been working with a wonderful group of dedicated partners from around the city, representing just kind of a great broad suite of kind of local interests and advocacy groups and communities and business interests to put together the core framework of the plan. And we've had a lot of actions that have been suggested by our council members that have come through in community surveys. We're looking to expand on that as we move into the spring, which is a great time for us to really branch out with our community engagement. But the core framework that we've put together, we've modeled all of the actions that we have in our plan to date. So if we were to completely fulfill all of the 90 actions that we have in our plan right now, we would not yet be able to hit the ambitious targets that we've been directed to pursue. So we do have more work to do. We are going to be continuously looking for ways to make those actions stronger, to look for new technology that can help us move in the direction we're trying to go. But I think there's two things that we really want to keep in mind. So if you look at this chart, that colored band represents all of the actions, the reductions that we're able to achieve with all of our actions. And you see there's still that gap at the bottom. So that is that's kind of the remaining gap that we still need to find strategies to fulfill. That gray line represents a straight line target to reaching the science recommended targets. So one thing that is encouraging for us, if we look at this, that gray dashed line kind of intersects with that at the 2030 mark. That tells us that we are hitting the science-based targets for greenhouse gas reduction. So that's really positive. Our goals tell us to do better and to do more, but we are on a strong pathway. We are making solid progress towards our goals if we fulfill what's contained in those actions. So to look at this another way, the federal and state actions really do a lot of the heavy lifting just because they get at some of those really, really big emitters, right? Improving building efficiency and improving fuel standards, like that has a huge impact that we're so grateful to the state for putting those regulations in place and the federal level, because a lot of those would be just really impossible for us to do at the local level. And strong guidance, strong leadership from the state. The requirements can be difficult. They can be a challenge for us to meet, but they really, really make a big difference for us in getting closer to our goals. That white line represents where, dashed in the middle, that represents the science-based target. So you can see we're exceeding that. However, we're trying to get to that orange line. So we're not done yet. We're going to keep moving. We're going to update our plan every 3 years so that we can keep looking for opportunities to make progress. But our goals were ambitious and we've got more work to do. This is just a look at our 2040 progress. Again, just to show that we do have further to go to meet our 2040 goal of carbon net neutrality as well. If we look at all of the actions that we have in our climate action plan to date, our biggest opportunities for cutting emissions come from the transportation sector. Our next biggest area of opportunity from the actions that we have are from buildings and energy. And then finally, green approaches, increasing the natural canopy cover, increasing our tree planting, improved soil management techniques throughout the city. Those things they don't emit greenhouse gases, so we're not trying to cut there. Those are our carbon sponges. So actions that help us expand our ecosystem services, those are a wonderful opportunity for us to, one, make progress on our greenhouse gas emission goals, but also beautify our city and help everyone be more comfortable as global climate changes, as our summers heat up. We want to make sure that people have lots of cool respite, cool places to go to keep cool and kind of reduce our urban heat island effects throughout the city as well. So that's a great area of opportunity for us too. When we're looking at the actions, we're trying to keep keep it a little high level and not get into the weeds on all of the individual actions, but this slide is just to emphasize that there are a few strategies that have an absolutely huge impact. Those are related to namely electrifying our transportation system, reducing vehicle miles traveled in the city, in the building and energy sector, switching to the lowest possible carbon fuel source. At present, that means electricity. Our natural gas partners would like to be very clear that they have aggressive targets to lower the carbon intensity of their fuel supply as well. Our aim is to be fuel source agnostic and focus on what our lowest possible carbon source is. So at present, there are so many actions that have an impact. There's some that we really just won't be able to get anywhere close to our goals without implementing. So I'll just take you through a quick run through of kind of the general kind of high level strategies that we're looking at for the different sectors, building energy, transportation, natural systems, wastewater. I'm sure these approaches will be pretty familiar to you. I think these are pretty standard approaches for any climate action plan, but for Vancouver, we are going to be focusing on reducing our building energy demand for commercial and residential buildings. We want to help our commercial and industrial sectors get in line for early adoption of the clean building standard so that they can be eligible for some of those incentive funds that can help people continue to make efficiency improvements, while also getting us, the sooner we can cut emissions, the better. So really those incentives from the state are just fantastic. And we want to do everything that we can as a city through education, through incentives, through partnerships, access to expert consultants to really help try to move people in that direction as quickly as we can. And again, to switch to the lowest carbon power source available for building, heating, cooking, and cooling. For our natural systems, we want to preserve all of the natural spaces and mature trees in particular that we have. Expand the green spaces that we do have, create more. I think the question was raised in Councillor Fox's presentation, how do we balance that need to grow densely and, kind of like try to make our land use efficient, but also keep green spaces, kind of expand the green spaces that we do have and make sure that we're incorporating trees and greenery into our building design. So that is a challenge that I think everyone is working on right now. There's some great research coming out of, I think it's Portland State University. They've been doing a lot of work on urban heat islands there. There are some great, there are some building designs work better than others. It's very site specific, but there's some principles that are starting to be developed for, how can we make sure that we're still incorporating this in the way that provides the most ecosystem services while still allowing us to maximize the housing or development potential of the land. I think another important concept that we're exploring is preserving space for green sinks within our cities. The other Vancouver, BC, has this, the second Vancouver, I would just note, we were the first city. They have an approach of developing kind of high-rise towers with dedicated park space in the vicinity of their, kind of like their high-rise areas. So for every intense development, you pair this with a dedicated green space. And those green spaces are really important for absorbing carbon and breaking up urban heat islands. I think that's a great strategy that, that we want to be exploring as well. Transportation, we want to make it as easy and comfortable as possible for people to walk, bike, and use transit to get where they need to go. And we also want to be accelerating our transition to zero emission vehicles. So that means, so of course that means EV infrastructure, but we also want to be looking at, how can we work with our local fuel suppliers to start educating people on using other types of fuel or the advantages of, switching from a regular diesel to a renewable diesel blend. How can we make it so that if you go to a gas station in 5 years, that you don't just have the option of, regular unleaded gasoline or diesel? Like you should have the option of filling up with renewable diesel. If you have a hydrogen fuel cell truck, there should be a way for you to, there should be a fueling facility for you. For compressed natural gas, propane, ethanol, there are a lot of fuels that are better and cleaner than what we are using now. They're great for our air quality as well as our emissions. So what do we need to do to lay the groundwork to make that transition? For land use, I think it's been said before in this meeting, how do we concentrate growth? How do we make sure that we're building efficient neighborhoods where people can choose to walk to get to the things that they need, or that we have neighborhoods that have enough density that they can support small neighborhood commercial businesses, and that they can support a transit-friendly environment. And so I want to wrap up quickly because I know we're running short on time. Just very quickly, we have a couple more analyses coming up. We want to make sure we're evaluating all of our actions, not just for carbon impact, but for things like cost. Equity is a huge concern for our council. Feasibility, how much public support does it have? Things like those. So we're in the process of conducting that analysis. We are doing a cost modeling exercise with our consultant. And we also have a lot of outreach coming up that we're excited about. We've been encouraged to try to particularly engage young people. So kind of older middle school students and teenagers and young adults, to try to make sure that we're not only hearing from people who are going to be inheriting this world from us, but also that we're helping to develop climate leaders for tomorrow. And I guess the final thought that I would want to leave everyone with is our outreach on this does not end when the plan is finalized. We've committed to updating our plan every 3 to 5 years, and that means that our education and communication with people about climate actions, that has to continue as well. And with that, I will hand it back to, hand the microphone back to our hosts.
Really great presentation, and I hereby anoint you forever in perpetuity to be the presenter to communities on climate action plans, because I thought your presentation was just like really well laid out and very clear and accessible, digestible for members of the public. So I want to compliment you on that. I've got a couple questions, but before we get into my questions, does anybody have anything they would like to ask about the Vancouver Climate Action Plan?
I have a question. So I'm thinking about City of Vancouver and the potential for it to expand in the near future, and that there's a huge, unincorporated area in its urban growth boundary. So I'm curious how, potential annexations are sort of being thought about in this climate, in the climate action plan so far.
That is a fantastic question. And as soon as we announced that we were doing a climate action plan, everybody in our planning development department was emailing us to ask us the same question. So in terms of annexation, there are some fairly large areas outside of the city that we are considering for annexation right now. Of course, the land use development patterns on those, they're very low density, not the best connectivity, multimodal connectivity. So it's a huge transition to try to go from the land use patterns that we know we need to get to our climate goals from where they are right now. So as part, what we are talking about right now with our planning department for actions related to that, in order to bring those areas into our urban area for annexation, we need to have a plan in place for how we are going to start making that transition. Obviously, there's a lot of kind of case-by-case situations, but the recommendation, so that it serves us, for our immediate challenge, and then like for any annexations going forward, before we do an annexation, we want to make sure that we have thought about a pathway to transitioning these areas into areas that can eventually be served by transit, and that can support a diverse mix of housing and help us get closer to our climate goals.
I noticed that you mentioned the different scopes 1, 2, and 3, and my ears perked up when you mentioned that, because on other climate action plans that I've worked on and other public engagement and outreach that we've done for climate action planning. Educating the public and really laying that out, what are the difference between the scope 1, the scope 2, the scope 3 emissions? Why do climate action plans focus usually primarily on scopes 1 and 2? When a lot of times, members of the public are thinking about scope 3 emissions as the thing that they want to see addressed. So my question to you is, in all of the outreach that you did you really have to do a lot of educating and doubling back on that messaging about the scope 1, 2, and 3, or were you able to find a way to sort of barrel that in a way that didn't slow down your momentum? And I'm a little bit curious about, did you rely more on science or did you rely on storytelling as part of the method of that approach?
Thank you. That's a great question. So we did not get a lot of pushback or kind of like continued questioning from our, kind of like our community roundtables or from the, kind of like the community when we surveyed folks. We didn't get a lot of interest from the people that we were talking to about addressing our scope 3 emissions. I think that there's so much opportunity for us to talk about that. We got some direction that, the city should focus on the kinds of things that the city is in a position to directly influence. And as you mentioned, a lot of the scope 3 emissions have to do with individual actions that people, can take, on their own. So it's more of an education effort. I think there's still a lot of opportunity for us to explore that. I think especially with aviation travel, I mean, there are things that we can do to cut those, if you educate people, there are better choices. People can choose to take direct flights, reduce the amount of luggage that they carry, to fly during the day instead of during the evening, which changes. That's a process I don't entirely understand, but there is some research that shows that flying during the daytime creates fewer emissions than flying at night. And some European airlines have enacted some regulations to try to limit the amount of evening flights. So I think there is actually a lot that we can do, and it's mostly a matter of educating the public. Our direction was to focus on the stuff that we could directly influence, and the folks that we've worked with so far seem to kind of adopt that mindset as well. I think that for any conversation that you're having with the general public, I think that storytelling is always the best way to go. It's pretty easy to, I personally really, I really like data visualization and data storytelling. So I don't think that the two need to be separate. But I think that when we're talking with the general public, I think that we need to use the data to tell the story and make sure that the data is not the story.
Yes, I would agree with you on that. Good tips, definitely. So appreciate those. Any other questions for Rebecca before we wrap up today? Thank all of our presenters. I thought this was really fascinating, really demonstrates the type of actions and the type of planning that's occurring in our region to address climate change, which, as we know, is an emergency. I do want to go over just a few things. I've put 4 different links in the chat. Rebecca's last point about sort of outreach continuing and how it really needs to be equitable, and we really step up and make sure that the outreach continues. The Oregon APA is going to be hosting an online event about making planning more accessible. So you can sign up for the link, sign up with the link in the chat box that I've put there. I also want to let you know that all of our sessions are recorded as well. We've got a YouTube channel that we've put together, and you can find our prelude to this session there. Would highly recommend that you check it out. We held that session in February. It's about public communications for wildfire recovery. Of course, we were devastated by wildfires in 2020, and that might continue and become a yearly occurrence. So it would be a good opportunity to check out how to really set up a PIO and get communications ready in the event that that occurs ever again in your community. And then we are wrapping up. We're going to wrap up right on time. The social justice moment, we were going to watch a couple different videos, but instead what I've done is I've put the links to those videos in the chat. So I sincerely hope that you'll check them out. The first social justice one is just a recording of a press conference that we held here in across the river in Portland last summer. Of course, we all remember that, I'm sure. But Multnomah County recorded at least 54 heat-related deaths due to that event. And it's sort of a way to end the presentation, but I think it's important to really understand what the stakes are, and the stakes are lives if we fail to do something to address climate. And then a slightly more positive video would be Social Justice Link number 2, which is a pretty humorous look at why certain neighborhoods have fewer trees than others and what we can do about it. So I hope you'll check that out as well and feel inspired to take action if you're not doing so already. So we're going to end on time. I want to thank all of our presenters and partners in this. Catherine, I want to thank you as well for helping us pull this together. Do you have any final comments? I see Valerie has also turned her camera on, so I'll invite her for any closing remarks as well.
Yeah, thanks. Valerie Smith here, Department of Commerce as well, and helping organize all of the regional planners forums. So thank you. This was wonderful. And let us know how we can better serve you as a section. Sorry, I couldn't hear you, Nick.
I'm asking Catherine if she's got any final thoughts, but I know her audio is a little tricky, so it looks like she's putting something in the chat. So we'll let her do that. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your attendance today. Please look for the recorded session on our YouTube channel, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much.